In today's video, I will be filling in a hypothetical 2024 Electoral College map if the polls once again underestimate Donald Trump. Now, my methodology here will be very simple. I'll be looking at each and every state and apply the 2020 polling error into each and every state. First off, the national vote here. Trump has a 0.3% lead over Joe Biden in a one-on-one race. And if you look at the polling from about the long-term graph here, Trump has been leading ever since about October of last year. While if we look at the general election polling back in 2020, Donald Trump really never led. In fact, polling overestimated Joe Biden here by 2.7 points. When you adjust that to the current popular vote, that means Trump will be ahead by 3 points. A remarkable performance considering in 2020, Joe Biden won the popular vote by 4.5 points, though he really just won the election by about 43,000 votes in 3 combined states, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. Therefore, we could be seeing an electoral college landslide for Donald Trump in this video. Now let's jump right into the states here. So starting off with Alabama in alphabetical order, in Alabama, Trump enjoys about a 21% advantage, and if you look at the 2020 margin here, the state overestimated Joe Biden in terms of support, and therefore it obviously goes to Trump by a safe margin. Now going to the state of Alaska here, back in 2020 here, the state also actually had about a 10-point race. Right now, Trump is leading by about 10 points. When you adjust for the polling error, it should be just sufficient for a safe margin in terms of a Donald Trump characterization, though it could be argued as likely. Now, next state here will be the state of Arizona, the first important state here. Now, right now, according to Arizona's polling average, Trump enjoys a 4.3% lead over Joe Biden. Now, what's extremely important is that Kennedy is taking about 10% of the vote, and that pretty much no candidate is near a majority. However, if you look at the 2020 numbers in the state, you see that Joe Biden actually underperformed polling by more than 2 points. When you add those two numbers together, it gives Trump about a lead of 7 percentage points, or sufficient for a likely margin. Now, I do not believe Trump will be winning the state by 7 points. I believe that the state will realistically be closer to something like 2 to 3 points. Nevertheless, I certainly agree right now that Trump is definitely favored in the state of Arizona for the time being. Now, next state here, which will be the state of Arkansas. Unsurprisingly, in Arkansas, Trump enjoys about a 28% advantage, while right now Trump will easily prevail. Polling in the state was very off. Trump had about a 2.5% lead in the state early on until about October when the margins finally deferred. Obviously, Trump will be winning Arkansas here by pretty much this polling error, probably by closer to 30 points. Now the next state here, which would be the state of California, Joe Biden is underperforming. He's only at 50% in the solid blue state of California. It's a state that voted for Biden by about 30 points. In 2020 here, we didn't have that many polls, but Trump and Biden pretty much met expectations, which means that Joe Biden will be winning the state of California, according to this map, by about 20 points. Nevertheless, that's not a great margin for a Democrat in California. Now, the next state here in alphabetical order is the state of Colorado. Surprisingly, we actually don't have a polling line, which is essentially the aggregate, but nevertheless here we do see that Joe Biden has about a 7-8% advantage in the state. Now in 2020, I would like to reiterate, this was one of the only, if not the only states that actually had polling that overestimated Donald Trump and underestimated Joe Biden, although by a very, very slim margin. We're going to be giving Colorado here to Joe Biden by a likely margin. Now that brings Joe Biden to 64 electoral votes and Donald Trump to 29 electoral college votes. Now the next state here is the state of Connecticut. Unsurprisingly, in Connecticut, Joe Biden does enjoy about 12% advantage, though this is actually very slim because he did win the state by about 20 back in 2020. So that is a bit of a concern. What's also a concern here is that Joe Biden is currently, in 2020, he significantly underperformed polling by about 6 points. When you adjust all of that, you see that Connecticut only narrowly goes to Joe Biden by a likely margin. Not a good sign when he won the state by 20 points back in 2020. Nevertheless, that does put Trump at about 42 electoral votes behind Joe Biden. Moving on here, the next state being the state of Delaware, which is Joe Biden's home state. Now, last time I checked, there were no polls in the state of Delaware, and this time when I check here, there's still no polls from Delaware. Nevertheless, we all know Delaware probably gonna go to Joe Biden by a solid margin. Now, going to the next state here, the District of Columbia, we see that Joe Biden is projected to win the district by holding about 90% of the vote by 85 percentage points back in 2020. This was actually an underestimation of Joe Biden, as Joe Biden got like 92% of the vote here. Obviously, Joe Biden will be winning the District of Columbia. Now the next state, the state of Florida here. Florida is remarkably interesting. We see the Cuban vote, right? That was something that was extremely significant to Trump's success. Trump is leading in the state now by about 10 points, and when we adjust it based on 2020 polling error, which essentially overestimated Joe Biden here by almost 6 points, 5.7 points to be exact, we do see that this state goes to Trump by a safe margin. This is consistent with the narrative we're talking about with about areas like Miami-Dade County, Palm Beach County, right? These are heavy Cuban counties, areas that have trended historically significantly towards Republicans, who historically have significantly voted for Democrats. Right, when Hispanic turnout was high back in 2020, we saw that many people were like, this state could be very close, or it could go to Joe Biden, but that was the wrong interpretation at the very end. Now going to the next state here in terms of the map, that being the state of Georgia, I believe. Yeah, in the state of Georgia right now, Trump holds a 6.3% lead over Joe Biden. Now, the state had pretty accurate polling data back in 2020. It only overestimated Joe Biden by about a point, which I would consider as pretty good. Now, right now, if you look at the scattering of polls, you can see that Trump is leading in every single one of them. Again, a terrible sign for for Joe Biden in terms of his re-election chances against Trump. Georgia is the state that considered by many as the most likely state to end up flipping, and it does make sense. We see that the rural areas are very conservative, and we also see that some of the suburban areas, they might just have depressed black turnout. Trump has been doing very well with black voters compared to other Republicans, polling at about 20%, if not slightly higher. That's an area where, in a state like Georgia, that difference could end up reflecting the vote significantly. I do believe that Trump will win the state of Georgia, though not by a likely margin. Nevertheless, here I do have Georgia right now. Based on this map, I'll put it in the likely category. Now going to the next state here, the state of Hawaii. Not very surprising, Joe Biden holds a significant lead over Donald Trump, though Joe Biden significantly underran expectations in Hawaii. The state essentially, shifted from about a Democrat plus 45 state now to about a Democrat plus 30 state. Nevertheless, safely in the Democratic column, putting Joe Biden at 81 electoral votes to Donald Trump at 75. We're in for a close race. Now going to the next state here in the state of Idaho here. Now in the state of Idaho back in 2020, Trump only had about 18.1% lead. Now he enjoys a 29% lead in the one lone poll. And we see that again in the state of Idaho, polling significantly underestimated Republican support by about 15 points. So I'm going to give it obviously to Donald Trump here by a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, the state of Illinois. Illinois is a state that could be surprisingly a bit more competitive than we thought. Back in 2020 here, Joe Biden underran expectations, winning the state by 17 points despite the very, very liberal area around Chicago. What we see in Illinois right now is that Joe Biden is leading the polling aggregate by about 12 points. But if we look at the 2020 polls here, Joe Biden did end up running at expectations, though he did end up running significantly below previous Democrats. Ultimately, Illinois in the safe blue column, bringing Joe Biden to 100 electoral votes, though the three remotely competitive states, Arizona, Georgia, and Florida, all went to Donald Trump. Now the next state over here in the alphabetical order here is the state of Indiana. Right now, it does have Trump up by about 20. If you look at the 2020 numbers here, I believe the state, it overestimated Joe Biden yet again. What we saw was that Trump overperformed by about 6 points, obviously going to Trump by a safe margin. Next, going to the state of Iowa. Here in the state of Iowa, we saw in 2020, the state significantly overestimated Joe Biden's support. Right now, however, Trump does enjoy about a 11% advantage. And if you look at 2020 here, I believe Joe Biden was expected to lose the state by just about 1 percentage point. Right now, however, we do have, according to the adjusted polling, that Trump would end up winning the state of Iowa by 15 points. Remarkable here because in 2012, just about a decade earlier, we saw that Barack Obama was able to win the state of Iowa by about 5 points. Now, the next state here is the state of, I believe, the state of Kansas. Now, Kansas is a state that could be competitive in the future. Nevertheless, it definitely isn't now. Trump does hold about a 15% lead in the state of Kansas. If you look at the 2020 election prediction margins here, Trump did narrowly overperform expectations, which does put the state in the safe Republican column. Now going to the next state here, which would end up being the state of Kentucky. Nothing surprising in Kentucky, Trump holds about 24% lead. In 2020 here, the polls did end up underestimating Donald Trump by about 8 points. Obviously, the state of Kentucky goes to Trump by a safe margin, and now Trump is at 110 electoral votes to Joe Biden at 100. Both have entered the 3 digits category. Now going to the next state here, which would end up being the state of Louisiana. Louisiana, obviously, the one poll here does have Trump up by just 15. But if you look at the 2020 numbers here, again, polls did underestimate Donald Trump here by about 3 to 4 points, which makes the state about a 20% win for Donald Trump, or a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, which would end up being now the state of Maine. Maine is interesting, one of the 2 states along with Nebraska to split its electoral college votes. Now it's a bit messed up here, but we do see in the Maine general election, we have Trump winning by 6 in one poll, Biden winning by 1 in another, and the oldest poll here, the poll that was taken more than a year ago, did have Joe Biden winning the state by 11. Now, I think the poll that is the closest to reality here is probably a Biden plus 1 poll, though I think Biden will probably win by more than that. But considering the fact that, again, this poll was taken so long ago, I'm actually going to put this state in the tilt Republican column, not because I think the state will go red, but just because, again, if you look at the pretty much the polling era back in 2020, it was pretty significant in favor of Joe Biden. Based on the polls and based on pretty much how old the polls were, I'm gonna put the state in the lean to tilt Republican column. Now the first district here, I'm gonna still give it to Joe Biden by a likely margin, but the second district, people were talking about it being closer. I'm gonna put it in the safe Republican column because the state is going red, and also because of the fact that really the second district does produce less votes, so it makes no sense if the district is actually in the likely Republican column. Now for next state here, which would end up being now the state of Maryland. Now, we aren't really surprised by the fact that the state of Maryland is going to Joe Biden here. According to all these polls, we don't have any of them in 2024, but in 2020, it obviously suggested the state was going to go for Joe Biden. Maryland obviously going to end up going blue. Now, next state here is the state of Massachusetts. In the state of Massachusetts right now for 2024, Joe Biden has been leading by various margins, though we all know that Biden is going to win the state of Massachusetts. And if you look at the 2020 polling era here, I believe the polling era was in favor of Biden, but in the end of the day, we are going to see Massachusetts going to the Democratic Party by a safe margin. Now, that does put us as a statistical tie here at Joe Biden at 122 electoral college votes and Donald Trump at 121. But the majority of states remain to be filled in. However, we do have the Democratic stronghold of California and a couple of the New England states, while a couple of states in the Midwest and around the Sun Belt have also been filled in. Now, next state here, which would be the state of Michigan. We see in the state of Michigan, this is a very, very crucial state. Although Michigan voted for Joe Biden here by close to 3 points, we saw a very, very high uncommitted vote in the state of Michigan, and that is very problematic for the Democratic Party overall. What we saw in Michigan as well in 2020 was a significant overestimation of Joe Biden. Joe Biden was overestimated by more than 5 points. If you apply this margin here, that would suggest that Joe Biden will be losing the state of Michigan by 9 points. Now, that is very unlikely. We see that county numbers still at about 9%. I do expect that to drop when the election actually comes. Nevertheless, this still does not look good for Joe Biden, especially because a recent poll dropped had Trump up by 15. Now, that does not make sense. Again, I'm saying, right, these outlier polls, these do not make sense. Nevertheless, we do see that in the state of Michigan, the consensus is generally that Trump is currently ahead. And right now, I'm going to give the state of Michigan to Donald Trump here by a likely margin. Now, next, going to the state of Minnesota here. In the state of Minnesota, we see that the general consensus is that Joe Biden is going to win Minnesota. In 2020 here, the polls did overestimate Joe Biden, but not by a significant margin. We're talking about a 2% difference, which is not as significant as some of the other Rust Belt states. Anyways, Biden is expected to win the state right now by about 4. We take away 2 points, that still gives Biden about a lead margin. However, that makes the state significantly more competitive than Michigan's about 9-point margin in favor of Donald Trump. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of Mississippi. Unsurprisingly, Trump up by 18. In 2020, the polls did end up underestimating Donald Trump again, though not by much, by about 1 percentage point. So we're still going to give the state of Mississippi to Donald Trump by a safe margin. Now that does get Trump over the halfway line, across the halfway line in this presidential race. We only have about 264 electoral college votes to go. Now, in the state of Missouri here, we see that Trump does have about a 15% lead according to polling. In 2020, though, his lead was much thinner at 8%. That was a single-digit lead. At the closest, the state was just about a 2.5% difference. We all knew that that was not going to be the case on Election Day. Nevertheless, we do have Missouri here going to Trump, obviously, by a safe margin of about 23% when the polls are adjusted. Now the next state here, which would be the state of Montana, this is a state, again, that Trump was not able to do very well in 2020 in terms of the polling. We saw in 2020 the polls had Trump winning the state with less than half of the vote. Now, at his peak, he was winning by about 21.3%, which was much closer to the final results, but on Election Day, he was only leading by 4.4 points. When we calculate the polling error here, we see that Trump is going to win the state of Montana by more than 30 points. I don't believe that that's likely, but again, that is a lot more likely than him actually losing the state of Montana. Now going to the next state here, the state of Nebraska. Nebraska is quite interesting. They have the split electoral college vote system. Right now, the 2 polls that have been published are Trump plus 60 and Trump plus 18. Now, if you look at the 2020 election cycle polling here, who is ahead in Nebraska? Now, this is a bit strange. I don't know what happened here. I think this is the Nebraska's 2nd congressional district polling. It does not make sense that Joe Biden is ahead in Nebraska. Again, this is a bit crazy, right? I think they just dumped all the polls, but all the polls were from Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Anyways, the polls significantly overestimated Joe Biden in the state. Anyways, this is a pretty much insanity here. I'm not sure what is wrong. Yeah, this was actually the polling for Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which actually underestimated Joe Biden. So I guess as of right now, just based on the fact we don't have congressional district polling, I'm going to just leave it in the likely blue column because, again, the district overestimated Donald Trump. Nevertheless, the other districts, as well as the at-large vote, goes to Trump by a safe margin. Now going to the state of Nevada here. Nevada is the only Clinton-Biden state that Trump has a good chance of actually contesting. I do believe that right now, Donald Trump will win the state of Nevada, and according to the polling averages, Trump enjoys a steady and constant 6% advantage over Joe Biden. Now that is really concerning for Biden, right? This is a state that Hillary Clinton was able to win, and if he's not able to win Clinton states, that is a big problem. This is a relatively electoral vote-wise less significant state, but still a big problem. We see that Trump has been leading in every single poll. If you want to show more polls here, you cannot find a single poll that actually has Joe Biden ahead in the last 40 polls. So it does make sense here right now that we do have Donald Trump winning by 6. And if you look at the 2020 margin of error here, the state did end up overestimating Joe Biden by close to 3%. So when we calculate all that in, that leaves us about a 9% victory for Donald Trump, a substantial lead. What we see in every single swing state, the most contentious 4 swing states here, the states of Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan, all of them are projected to go for Trump in this particular matchup by between 7 and 10%. Remember, all 4 voted for Biden in 2020. One of the 4, Nevada, actually voted for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. The fact that Trump is doing this well and Joe Biden really doing this poorly in this map speaks volumes. Furthermore, Maine's at-large vote is right now in the tilt Republican column. That is ridiculously concerning for a Democrat, considering just about 2 decades ago, this was a safe blue state. This was a state that Obama won by 20, a state that, Al Gore was able to win by like 20, so it's a big concern for the Democratic Party. Now, the next state here is the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is quite an interesting swing state compared to the other states. It's a state where you generally see that Biden is actually ahead of Donald Trump, one of the few swing states that actually have such a result. What we see here is that Trump is down by about 5 to 7 points on average. And if you look at the 2020 election cycle, the state definitely overestimated Joe Biden, but not by enough of a margin for me to say that Joe Biden actually loses New Hampshire, though it is going to be close when you adjust it for the polling error of about 4 points. Now, the next state here, which would be the state of New Jersey. In the state of New Jersey here, Joe Biden is only up by about 5 points, a very concerning number. Now, in 2020 here, what we saw in the final days of the election was that Joe Biden was up 20 points by the polling numbers. And I just want to make sure here, because New Jersey, I believe, voted for Joe Biden by 16, that would actually mean New Jersey moves down to the tilt Democratic category, which would be very much remarkably concerning, probably because there is a competitive Senate race there, perhaps because Bob Menendez is resigning because he is essentially being charged with a bunch of cases. What we do see in New Jersey right now is a tilt Democratic victory in New Jersey. That is obviously not going to happen. Joe Biden's going to win the state by a likely or safe margin. Nevertheless, here, the fact that this is even a possibility is still concerning. Anyways, Biden does have crossed 150 electoral votes. Donald Trump at 166. Going to the state of New Mexico, here in the state of New Mexico, Joe Biden has a lead in every poll, though by varying different margins, but of between 6 and 11 points. Back in 2020, the state did end up slightly overestimating Joe Biden, but not by enough to really change the dynamic. The state overestimated Joe Biden by just about a point, which is still sufficient right now, even after the adjustment, for Joe Biden to win the state of New Mexico by a likely margin. Now going to the next state here, the state of New York. Now New York is a state that could be surprisingly competitive. In 2024, what we see is that Joe Biden is on average winning the state by about 10 points, which is a concerning margin because he won the state back in 2020 by a margin of 23 points. What we're seeing is that Democrats are not doing very well in the New York City area, the densely populated regions across the state. Specifically, we also see some of the more conservative areas, for example, Suffolk County, or a more competitive county, Nassau County. Or even if you go to Queens here, Democrats have been generally underperforming. Nevertheless, here we do see New York probably the Empire State's gonna go for Joe Biden, just the margin's gonna look a bit shady for Biden. Right now, however, Biden is back in 2020 was up by about 30% on polling. He only won it by 23. When you adjust it for the polling error, it actually only shows a Biden plus 3 state in the state of New York. Now that is again a very concerning sign for Biden, though again I do not believe that will actually end up happening. Now going to the state of North Carolina here. Now in the state of North Carolina, I do have the polling does have Donald Trump up by about 5 points. Now this is reasonable in my opinion. I do believe that Trump will win it by between about a 4 to 5 point margin, if not a bit higher. In 2020 here in the state of North Carolina, Joe Biden was expected to win it by about a 2% margin. The polls were wrong by about a 3% margin. When you adjust that, that is about a 8% win for Donald Trump in the state of North Carolina. Again, a pretty substantial victory considering back in 2016 and 2020, the state in those two state elections combined, when you combine those margins, Trump only won it by about 5 points. So again, North Carolina, a very substantial victory here for Donald Trump. Now going to the state of North Dakota here, not very surprising. Trump is at plus 37 in the most recent poll, and back in 2020, the state overestimated Joe Biden by like 20 points. So when all things being considered, I do have the state of North Dakota as safe for the Republican Party, not very surprising. Joe Biden at 184 electoral votes, Donald Trump at 185. We're in a statistical tie as of right now. However, the remaining states here are largely conservative states: Oklahoma, Tennessee, South Carolina, West Virginia, South Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, right? There's a lot of conservative states left to be filled in. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of Ohio. Now this is a very interesting one as well. Used to be a bellwether pick. There correct president for 60 years in terms of the presidential election level. Nevertheless, here Ohio has trended remarkably to the Republican Party. Trump is up by nearly 10%. And if you look at the 2020 polling error here, Joe Biden was actually down by just less than 1 percentage point. He lost the state by about 8. So when we consider the polling error, that's about 7% error in favor of Joe Biden. When you consider it with the 9% margin, that means that Trump will win the state by about 17%, a huge margin. Moving along here, the next state is the state of Oklahoma. We see in Oklahoma, Trump has about a 27% lead over Joe Biden, though there is one outlier poll which has Joe Biden within about a 12% margin. Nevertheless, in 2020, polls once again overestimated Joe Biden's support by about 5 points, which would end up putting the state again in the safe Republican column. Now Trump is inching very close. He's only 60 electoral votes away from tying the Electoral College. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of Oregon. Unsurprisingly, Joe Biden does have a lead in the state of Oregon, though only by 12.5%. And if we look at the polling error here, the state in general overestimated Joe Biden here by about 4%, which means when we consider all of those factors, the state of Oregon is only in the likely Democratic column. Now going to the next state here, the state of Pennsylvania. This is a huge one. Joe Biden must win the state of Pennsylvania to win the election. For Trump, it's not a must win. All Trump needs to do is win the state of Georgia and then flip Pennsylvania, and he's at 270 electoral college votes. Nevertheless, right now speaking, Trump and Joe Biden are pretty much in a statistical tie. We see that Joe Biden is actually up by 10% in one outlier poll, but nevertheless, in most of the polls here, Trump does enjoy a slight lead. Now, in 2020, however, the polls were so off in the state of Pennsylvania. Not as much as some of the other competitive states, where Joe Biden was only up by about 4.7, but when I say only, it's because in Michigan and Wisconsin, Joe Biden was up by 7-8 points. Nevertheless, the state overestimated Joe Biden by 3.5, add that to a 1.0% margin right now, and that is a state that's going to go for Donald Trump here by about 4.5 percentage points, or in a very high lean margin, inching close to a likely margin. Now we're seeing here in all of the swing states, except two, which is pretty much Minnesota and New Hampshire. Not surprising, both of them are voting for Biden. Right now, every single other competitive state, or even remotely competitive state right now, is going to Donald Trump. He's already at 228 electoral votes, only 4 away from his 2016 performance, and we have all these states left to go into. Now going to the next state here, the state of Rhode Island. Not surprising, Joe Biden does have about a 14% advantage, though in 2020, the polls significantly again overestimated Joe Biden by about 10 points. When we actually consider that in, Joe Biden is only up in the polling by about 5%, which is just enough for a likely margin. Now going to the next state here is the state of, I believe, the state of South Carolina. In the state of South Carolina, Trump has about a 15% advantage over Joe Biden. And if you look at the 2020 margin here, we see that again, right? The state overestimated Joe Biden here by about 5%. When we consider all that in, that's about 20% margin here for Donald Trump, or another safe margin. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of what we see, the state of South Dakota. Unsurprisingly, South Dakota is going to go for Donald Trump here by a safe margin, though polls have it a slightly bit closer than what it was back in 2020. Nevertheless, in 2020, polls again overestimated Joe Biden here by about 10%. When we consider that in, again, a safe margin for Donald Trump. Trump is at 240 electoral votes, Joe Biden at just 196. Now going to the state of Tennessee here. Now in the state of Tennessee, we see that again, Donald Trump here is up in the polls by about a 25% margin. There's still actually quite a few polls in the state of Tennessee. Nevertheless, if you look at the 2020 margin of error, again, what we see is that Donald Trump overperformed the polls by about 10%. So we have the state of Tennessee easily going for Donald Trump. Now going to the next state here, again, that will be the state of Texas. Texas with its 40 electoral votes. If Joe Biden is able to flip the state of Texas, maybe he can win this electoral map, but we obviously know in our minds that that is not going to happen. The state of Texas right now, a 9.9% margin for Donald Trump, just shy of double digits. And in 2020 here, the state was very close according to the final map. We saw that Donald Trump was only up by about 1.1%, a razor-thin margin, while Joe Biden actually ended up losing the state to Donald Trump by a likely 5.6% margin. When we add those two numbers up, pretty much the polling error plus the current margin, Joe Biden is going to be losing the state of Texas by 14 points, sufficient for a safe margin for Donald Trump, putting him over the finish line at 291 electoral votes, Joe Biden at 196 electoral votes as of right now, almost a 100 electoral vote difference. Now going to the state of Utah here. In the state of Utah here, we actually see quite a different dynamic as opposed to some of the other states. In Utah right now, the polling difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is just about 11 points. Not so good for Trump, who won the state by about 22 points. Nevertheless, in 2020, the margin of error here in the state was quite substantial. Donald Trump was essentially polling at the same number that he is right now. So it's not surprising he is behind. Trump won the state by 22 points, and realistically, he's going to end up winning it by again. And based on the polling error, we're going to see that Trump is going to win the state by a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of Vermont. Not surprising, Vermont is going to go for Joe Biden. Right now he leads by 30 points, though that is a slimmer margin than the 38.7% lead he had in 2020. Nevertheless here, even when you adjust for polling error, Trump is still going to lose the state of Vermont by about 22%. Bernie Sanders' home state. Now going to the next state here, which would end up being the state of Virginia. In the state of Virginia right now, what we see is that Joe Biden does have about a 5% lead over Donald Trump in terms of the average. Now, if we look at the difference between Joe Biden and Haley, what we see is that Nikki Haley is actually ahead of Joe Biden in terms of the polling. That's not surprising. There's a lot of suburban voters who are energetic to vote for Haley, but not so much for Donald Trump. However, if you look at the polling error back in 2020, what we see is that in this 2020 polling error, Joe Biden was overestimated by about 1.8%. Nevertheless, even after considering the polling error, Donald Trump is still going to lose the state of Virginia by about a lean margin. What's incredible here is that New Jersey is actually closer than Virginia. Obviously, these polls are pretty inaccurate just based on how we're seeing them on this map right now. Now going to this next state here, the state of Washington. In the state of Washington, Joe Biden holds about a 15% advantage, maybe slightly less than that. While in 2020 here, Joe Biden held a much larger advantage at about 23%. When we adjust for the polling error, we actually see that Joe Biden's only going to win the state by about 10, which is only sufficient for a likely margin. Not so good for a state that Biden was able to win by about almost 20 points back in 2020. Now going to the next state here, which is the state of West Virginia. In the state of West Virginia, Trump does have a 37% advantage over Joe Biden. Not too surprising, in 2020 though, the polling error again overestimated Trump by about 12 points. Nevertheless, the state of West Virginia easy Trump state by about 50 points according to this current map right now. Now going to the next state here, the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a crucial state for 2020. It's pretty much a must-win for Joe Biden, just like the state of Pennsylvania. Nevertheless here, he is trailing in the state of Wisconsin as well as Pennsylvania, though again by relatively slim 1.3%. Now 1 point Joe Biden was actually ahead in the aggregate. Nevertheless, some recent polls, just this one by Kaplan Strategies, have put Trump over the top here by about 10 points again. What we're seeing here is that Joe Biden is actually still trailing by in pretty much every single poll, so I'm not sure why I had Joe Biden ahead. Anyways, here Trump does have a 1.3% lead, but again, when we compare it to the 2020 polling averages, we saw that the state overestimated Joe Biden by about 7.7%. We add that to the 1.3% gap, and Donald Trump is expected to win Wisconsin by 9 percentage points, a really good margin. We're going to finish this off with the state of Wyoming. Not surprising here, I'm super lazy. Wyoming, 53% margin for Trump. I'm not even going to adjust it. It's going to go for Donald Trump. Now, in conclusion, what do we see on this map? There is one piece of bad news for Donald Trump, I guess, which is that his ceiling is not that high. It's at around 314 electoral college votes. However, in the divisive nature of today's political world, this is still a relatively good margin, especially if you look at the margins in all the competitive states here. Right, Nevada was like Trump plus 7, Arizona was like Trump plus 8, Georgia was like Trump plus 9, North Carolina was like Trump plus 7, Wisconsin was Trump plus 9, Michigan was like Trump plus 8, and Pennsylvania was like Trump plus 4.5. All these competitive states, pretty much all of them voted for Donald Trump in 2020, and 16 by very, very narrow margins, and then voted for Joe Biden in 2020, the fact that he is able to win by such significant margins is a very good piece of news for Donald Trump. Further, we see that some of the competitive states here that traditionally aren't competitive here in New York, the state of New Jersey here, all in play in this map, at least for Donald Trump. Now, that's not going to happen. We're not going to see New York go below a 12% margin for Joe Biden in all likelihood, and New Jersey is not going to be a tilt margin. Nevertheless, this map is good news for Donald Trump. It shows that, again, if he is able to do what he is able to do in 2020, he easily win the election. However, this is definitely not the most likely map. In fact, the most likely scenario is that either the polls are actually accurate, or if Joe Biden ends up slightly overperforming the polls. Nevertheless, here, if you want to see a video where the polls are accurate, click on the screen right now. If you want to subscribe, also click on the screen on the icon. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.